So while the internal lens talks about personal responsibility and choices um, and the role that our inner conscience plays in our internal compass, the external compass is where we look external to others and um, we decide whether or not we are ethical based on how we are viewed by those around us. In communal um, societies versus individualistic, collectivistic societies, communal societies are much more influenced by what the peer group says and what is expected of them. In some cultures, you are not expected to stand out. You are expected to blend in and be a part of the whole. Versus in the United States or in Australia, where we are very individualistic in our style and our approach to things, and this individualism really drives us to think more about what our own core value is and what our internal compass is. So I can imagine that collectivist societies tend more towards the external compass, thinking about those external um, judgments of our behaviors and how we want to be perceived by others in society or by the God that we worship or the organization that I work in. So if we're trying to determine, am I acting ethically? You're asking yourself that big question. And it really depends on who's answering the question. It depends on whether you are drawn more towards the internal compass or the external compass or some combination of the two, as you'll see here. If the answer to the question, am I being ethical, is being answered by my own opinions or my own point of view and my own personal standards, then that's your internal compass. And this picture is a great example of each of these young ladies are ready to go out to have their evening of fun, and they're all dressed differently based on their own internal standards of what they believe looks good. As you can see, there's all sorts of differences in the way that they're approaching going out and having fun. And again, the goal here is you behave in a way that's consistent with your standards. And those standards are developed, your internal standards are developed over time by the influence from those around you and the influence of your life experiences. And then from there, that internal compass develops. And we all develop an internal compass, except for some people that becomes the driving force of their ethical behaviors versus others where it may be balanced with the external compass and what that means. If the if the answer to the question is based on how society judges you or how some omniscient being, your God, judges you, then and those are the standards against which you're being judged. It's what others think or what God thinks of you or Allah thinks of you. Then it is your external compass that is guiding how you behave. And for all of us, there's usually some combination of internal and external. For some people, external drives them more. For some people, internal drives them more. But all of those are intertwined and interact quite heavily. Ultimately, when we are thinking about ethical behavior and what is right or what is wrong, it really just depends on perspective. It depends on the place where you're at, the context that you're working within, how you view the world. And these are two great ways of thinking about these two quotes really, I think, capture this idea. And first of all, you've got Schopenhauer, who's a German philosopher, who argues that if you're sitting in a balloon and that balloon is ascending from the earth, you don't believe as you're sitting in that balloon that you're ascending because your perspective is the balloon is the stable thing. That's where you're at. That's what you are sitting in. And your perspective emanates from the balloon. And so all you do is see the earth sinking away from you. You don't recognize that you are rising above the earth. It's all in the perspective. Those that are on the earth see you rising. You sitting in the balloon see everybody falling back and away, sinking away, deeper away from you. So you can understand how, depending on where you're sitting, you see something very different. And there's the old, the adage that if you blindfold, a man and have him put his hands on an elephant, he may not recognize what he's seeing with his hands or what he's experiencing with his hands, because it's all different perspectives. And when you lose your sight, you lose some of the input that gives you insight and sort of how to interpret things. And it's the same sort of idea. It's all in perspective. It's all in what you understand, what your world looks like, and then how you choose then to experience the world based on that. I like the Proust quote as well, where it says the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking the new landscapes, but in having new eyes. And that's my goal in this class, is truly to not have you just dig in and not experience the world through different eyes. I want you to see things differently. I want you to walk in someone else's shoes. I want you to try to see multiple perspectives. And the goal here isn't for me to change your mind. I'm not interested in having you change your values or change your beliefs or change your, that core internal. But what I am asking you to do is to recognize that it isn't an issue of I'm right, you're wrong in all circumstances. That oftentimes when we're thinking about perspective, it's just my point of view. You have your point of view. And I may not agree with you, but I'm going to try to understand it so that I can hopefully help either to persuade you or convince you in a different way, if I can understand your baseline assumptions, or we can come to an agreement that pleases both of us. Even if we disagree on some fundamental values, we find a way to still continue to work together. And that really is my goal in this class, helping you to see other perspectives around issues of ethics and around issues of the way that we make decisions, to help you then, as you go to the organizations and go into your jobs, to recognize that even though you have an idea, somebody else also has an idea. Let's hear what they have to say. And let's respect it as a viable idea that has value, and someone else's experience has value, and see what we can do to at least better understand somebody else. So we've talked about compliance. We've talked about the role of ethical compliance programs involved in training and setting up rules and policies about the way things should be, sort of developing the fundamental ethical culture of the company. But ethics is different than compliance. Compliance is simply what we do to make sure we're in alignment, to make sure everybody's on the same page with what the core values for the company need to be, to make sure that we're in alignment with the expectations of the law, of government agencies, of our own self-regulating bodies. We have to be in alignment with that. But the values that guide the compliance programs are really based on our own values, or based on the values of the top management team, the CEO, the board of directors. They set the values and the tones and the culture, and then the compliance program is developed to help implement the ethical norms of the company. And the goal here is that if we're not clear about what our values are, your compliance programs will not be effective. We have to be clear about what those underlying values are. And then from there, it helps to develop the underlying culture and norms and values and mission of the company. And from there, we can build our compliance program and help to make sure our employees are all in alignment on how to behave, which ultimately affects the reputation of the business. And so what we want is a strong reputation, but what we need at our base is strong values about what we believe is right and what we believe is wrong. And getting everybody on the same page That's the job of compliance programs, is making sure everybody understands what that is. You can still be an ethical company without a compliance program, but you need to have some sense of systems in place to communicate to people what your ethical values are and what you stand for. The relationship between the law and ethics is interesting. People assume that the law means something is ethical. So if it's legal, then it's ethical. And that's not always the case. I mean, we have to recognize that here in the United States, um, there have been times when slavery was considered legal, that you could own a human being. There are times in European history where we believe that the Holocaust was a completely legal behavior, that you could gather up people, put them in concentration camps, and ultimately kill them. There was a belief in this country at some point in time that segregation, separate but equal, which we know was not equal, but it was certainly separate, was also a legal behavior. It was legal to do that. It was legal to have two sets of societies in the same community where they weren't allowed to mingle. In this country, based on our norms, our constitution, our values, we recognize that the state or government or the law is really not the metrics that we should use for morality, that the law is not always right and oftentimes lags behind ethical norms and ethical outrage. It takes a while for it to catch up. Laws are not necessarily representative of good morals. They're just the representation of what people want. And people are not always collectively moral or ethical. And therein lies our challenge in society. What one group thinks is moral and ethical, another group does not, and it creates the tensions that we experience. The law doesn't capture every potential ethical dilemma. And as these dilemmas arise, particularly as we have new technologies and new ways of doing work and new experiences with people, we create new ethical dilemmas. And as we create these new ethical dilemmas, we need ways to work through them. The law catches up to the ethical dilemmas in time, hopefully, but it does take a while to get there. They will get there eventually. So now, as we leave the realm of what is ethics and why do we care about it, we now move into the different impact that ethics has on the ways that we make decisions. And there's a number of steps to consider, particularly around these issues of stakeholders and why we care about our stakeholders. So in order to make good ethical decisions, there's some prerequisites, if you will, that we need to see in order for us to behave ethically. Number one, we need to see an awareness of an ethical problem. And as you'll see when we get to our 8 steps of decision making, ethical decision making, in one of the next couple slides, you'll see that awareness of the decision and the awareness that it's a problem is a big key issue. And this is where organizations can help you, right? I can't teach you what your morals are, but I can teach you where there are dilemmas, where there are potential landmines that you're going to step into, where there is the potential for fraud, the potential for unethical behavior to occur, where bias is likely to happen. So in my ethics training in my organizations, I'm training you on where those weak spots are, so that you're aware when you approach that problem, you know you've got to be really careful, really mindful about thinking about all sides. Then you have to be able to reason through it. Just because you're aware doesn't necessarily mean that you can reason through the ethical issue. That requires you, again, to be present, to be mindful, to be able to see both sides, to be aware of biases, to set aside your own views, to understand the views of another. And that's an incredibly challenging behavior, but it's one that we're going to get to practice in this class. being aware and being able to reason still does not necessarily mean you're going to engage in ethical decisions, because you have to have the motivation to behave ethically. If you don't have the motivation to behave ethically, then you won't. No one will make you do it. But that's the challenge. And there's nothing that I can do as a teacher or anybody can do for you. If you don't have the motivation to act ethically, it's not going to happen. So organizations recognize that that's the end of their influence right there. They can influence 1 and 2. They can help you become aware. They can help you to reason through these issues, but they cannot make you motivated to act ethically. It's just almost impossible to do that. Someone has to have the desire within themselves to do the right thing, however they define that. Lastly, having the persistence or courage or fortitude to implement ethical behaviors even when faced with obstacles. This is a big challenge. So in order for you to act ethically, it doesn't mean that your beliefs are bad, or it just doesn't mean that it's just based on your beliefs. But in order to take your beliefs and put them into action, you have to be able to push through the challenges that come with being a whistleblower. And you can talk about the impact of having the resilience to push through when you are whistleblowing and somebody retaliates against you, right? That was a big part of the Martin Marietta case, right? Is what happens when you move forward with a complaint and there's a potential for retaliation. Doesn't mean that you are a bad person because you see unethical behaviors and you choose not to report it. Sometimes you have to make a choice that works for your family and works for you based on the situation that you're in. You may find that you need your paycheck. You might find that you have a sick child who needs health insurance, and you don't want to lose your job. You don't want to be ostracized by your family, your community, your job, your coworkers, your peers. There's all sorts of reasons why people choose not to report unethical behaviors. All right, and so you have to have that resilience and willingness to say, I'm going to do the right thing, even if it doesn't work out well. I'm going to do this even if it comes back to haunt me. I'm going to do this even if I get hurt by this. And not everybody has the ability to do that at all times in their life. The goal is to approach that as often as you can, so that as a whistleblower, you're willing to report when you see bad things happen. But recognize that it's not going to be an easy road if you are reporting somebody else's unethical behaviors. You also have to recognize that in choosing to do the ethical thing, it may have repercussions, that it may be people are going to fight you. People are going to say that you're wrong, that you're not taking the company's perspective into mind, and you're putting ethics above profit. Ethics, always comes hand in hand with profit. The more ethical, the more profitable, in my mind, anyway. So the goal here is you need awareness. You need to be able to reason through it. You need the motivation to behave ethically, and you need to have the persistence to continue to do ethical behaviors that are appropriate, to report, whistleblowing, unethical behaviors when you see it, or to engage in those ethical behaviors yourself, to do the right thing, even when there's pressure to not do the right thing. You need to have both. The last thing you have to be aware of when we're thinking about ethics and ethical decision making is stakeholders and our accountability to our stakeholders. The shareholder approach, as we'll get into when we talk about corporate social responsibility, is that shareholder profitability is the only thing that matters. This is a very basic Milton Friedman approach, the shareholder approach, that the shareholder primacy is what matters, that if we do exactly what we think is best for us and be damned to everybody else, as long as we're making money, that's all that matters. And here's the the more complex situation, which is that stakeholders, when we work well with our stakeholders, and when we don't try to dominate them, or we don't try to bully them, when we work cooperatively with them, we are far more likely to make more money engaging in appropriate business tactics and business behaviors, and looking out for our stakeholders, and so that everybody can benefit, making sure it's a win-win situation. And we'll talk much more about this when we talk about stakeholder versus shareholder theory. But the goal here with the stakeholder approach is that we are enmeshed in these very complex relationships with others with whom we have to do work on a regular basis. And this could be, our task-specific environment, which is our employees and our suppliers and our customers and our shareholders. And then we have the larger environment, which is the local community and the natural environment and non-governmental organizations that are going to be influenced by our behaviors, or other countries that may be influenced by our behaviors, and how important it is, how essential it is for us to be able to work hand in hand with these stakeholders to build good relationships and create value for everybody. And a lot of the work on strategic philanthropy and stakeholder value is when we value and engage in behaviors that are good for everybody, everybody wins. And so what we're looking at then with stakeholders and doing stakeholder analysis is we're evaluating the morality of our behaviors, the political impact of our behaviors, the environmental impact of our behaviors, the human welfare, the general human welfare impact of our behaviors, and the economic impact of our behaviors. Oftentimes we put too much emphasis on the economic side and not enough emphasis on the human welfare and environmental side. And so I think that's where we need to spend a lot more time thinking about these things.